Right, pnawn da pawb, a chroeso I gyfarfod blynyddol mis Ionawr grŵp cenedlaethol cymrodi'r Cymdeithas Hynafiaethwyr Llundain Cymru. Ar-lein wrth gwrs, yn unig eleni fel sy'n angenrheidiol. A very good afternoon and a very warm welcome to everybody to this meeting, which is organised by the Welsh Fellows Regional Group of the Society of Antiquaries. On behalf of the Welsh Fellows, an especially warm welcome to anybody who's attending one of our events for the first time today. A social seminar around this time in January is a regular item in our calendar of activities. Usually the talk is preceded by a fine buffet lunch, and saying that does nowadays sound a bit like bragging just how dangerously we've liked to live in the past, but things are of course much more distanced and hygienic this afternoon. I really do want to point out that the Welsh Fellows Group is by no means restricted to those who live or work in Wales, or indeed who would necessarily identify as Welsh in the modern parlance. All you would need to do to be part of this group is to have a real interest in the activities that the group actually has. I'm happy to say to everybody that we're remaining doggedly optimistic for 2021. The Thursday ordinary meeting, which is usually held out of London in Cardiff in early March, is of course going to have to be online this year, but we do have for Thursday the 4th of March, Alistair Whittle and Bill Britnell lined up to be talking on the Neolithic long cairns at Pen y Wyrlod and Gwernvale by the Black Mountains. We also very much hope that conditions will allow us to organise a day visit somewhere to see a couple of sites in late June probably, or earlier July. Presumably, of course, that'll all going to have to be al fresco and suitably spread out, but should still be a well worthwhile and enjoyable thing if conditions will allow it. We're also working on the cautiously optimistic hope that the usual weekend visit to an area is going to be able to go ahead in October this year, and we've provisionally rebooked what we had planned for October last year, that is with places at the Commodore Hotel in Llandrindod, Wales, for the weekend of Friday the 15th to the 17th of October. More details on these events will be sent around through our mailing list when we're able to do that. I'm going to emphasize with that as well as the invitation to people to join the group if they would like to, the fact that because of modern data protection laws, we do need your express and written permission to be able to put you on a mailing list. And if you haven't given that yet, then please do get in touch with either myself or Chris Jones-Jenkins, and we'll sort out how that can be done. But after that brief introduction, we're going to be moving on now to the main scholarly part of our meeting this afternoon, which is going to be a talk given by two much valued colleagues and people who are very familiar with the with Welsh archaeology, Dr. Andy Seaman, who's a lecturer in Canterbury, and Dr. Tudur Davies, who is a consultant but also works for the Department of Continuing Education in Cardiff. There is going to be a question and answer session at the end of the talk. Because of the circumstances of online events such as this, we have to maintain the practice that if anybody would like to ask a question or make a comment, please type that into the chat function. If you're on Zoom, we're probably all very familiar with it now, but just in case you aren't, you should down at the bottom see a little bubble with chat underneath. If you tap on that, you can type in a question or a comment there. Please type it in there, and then I will be putting those questions and comments at the end of the lecture. We say generally, please hold your questions till towards the end of the lecture, but actually if something you think you might slip, don't worry about putting it into the chat because it'll sit there safely. Dr. Andy Seaman is, as I said, subject lecturer and subject lead for archaeology at Canterbury Christ Church University. He studied at Cardiff University before working in commercial archaeology and then moving back into the academic world. His research focuses on early medieval Western Britain. A recent publication, co-edited with Rhiannon Comau, is Living Off the Land Agriculture in Medieval Wales, and also a paper, Hill Forts and Power, a GIS-enabled analysis of Dinas Powys. He's currently completing, I beg your pardon, a major AHRC-funded study of the Roman to early medieval transition in South Wales and working on a monograph entitled Hill Forts and Social Change, Western Britain circa AD 300 to 700. Dr. Tydir Davis works as an independent environmental and landscape archaeological consultant and specialises in pollen analysis. He also contributes as a teacher in the continuing education department at Cardiff University, as well as being an honorary research fellow at the University of Exeter. His university career started with a Bachelor of Arts degree at Durham, followed by a Master's in Landscape Archaeology at the University of Sheffield, where he also took his PhD examining the environment of early medieval North Wales by undertaking geoarchaeological and palynological analysis of lake sediments from Llyn Tegid and peat deposits from its hinterland. Tydir has a keen interest in the early medieval archaeology of the whole of Wales and combining landscape and environmental archaeological approaches to the study of the past. He's got more than 10 years experience working on and supervising commercial and research-driven archaeological projects as far afield as Australia, Cambodia, Denmark, Spain, and Turkey, as well as here in the UK. So I'm happy now to pass on over to Andy to start off, please. So if you'll, the screen is up there sharing, so we should be fine to go from there. Thank you very much, Andy.
Thank you very much for that kind introduction, John. There we go. Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to be invited to deliver this lecture. And whilst it is a shame that we cannot be with you in person, we hope that this online format has permitted wider participation than might otherwise have been possible. Today, we're going to talk about the preliminary results of the HRC-funded Manifestations of Empire research project. This is a joint initiative between Canterbury Christ Church University and the University of Exeter. And whilst this paper is presented by Tydir and I, the research is a collaboration with our co-investigator, Professor Stephen Rippon. I should also note that we had hoped to have completed the project by this stage, but the COVID-19 restrictions have introduced significant delays. So please consider our data and interpretations as preliminary. This project aims to examine two research questions, one methodological in nature, and the other addressing a specific historical problem. The methodological context focuses on the utility of pollen analysis in historic landscape archaeology. The identification and quantification of long-term sequences of preserved pollen grains is a well-established technique for reconstructing chronological changes in environment and patterns of land use. The resulting data can be used to explore social and economic questions posed by on-site archaeological evidence. However, pollen analysis, as traditionally configured, is most suited to exploring broad regional patterns over long periods of time. Thus, its effectiveness for historical archaeology is limited. One of the aims of this project is, therefore, to develop and enhance methodologies that can be used to explore short-term, localized patterns related to processes taking place over an historic scale. The second research context focuses on one of the most debated topics in the archaeology and history of the first millennium AD, the ending of Roman Britain. This is a complex topic, and we can reconstruct only a broad outline of events. The conventional narrative may be summarized as follows. In the late 4th century AD, southern Britain appears to have witnessed some level of political disruption, which included the usurpation of Magnus Maximus. A series of British emperors, ending in Constantine III, were then proclaimed in the first decade of the 5th century, until official Roman imperial administration came to an end around the year 408 and was not re-established. It is usually argued that there followed a period of significant social, political, and economic transformation, and that in the second half of the 5th century, it is possible to trace in the archaeological record the emergence of new, very different political formations. In the south and the east, these are traditionally characterized as Anglo-Saxon, and this region is seen as being heavily influenced by migration and settlement of peoples from the continent. It is argued that in the west, we see the emergence of independent Brittonic kingdoms, which have a very different and somewhat ephemeral archaeological signature, characterized, in some areas at least, by kiss cemeteries, the reoccupation of hill forts, and Latin and or Ogham inscribed memorial stones. However, there is little consensus as to the nature of the changes that characterize the late 4th, 5th, and 6th centuries in southern Britain. And even the broad outline that I have sketched here is very much contested. Thus, there is considerable debate over a series of important questions. These include whether the 4th century was indeed a period of decline, the extent and pace of change in the 5th century, the scale and significance of migration and other processes such as climate change, the extent of regional difference, not just between East and West, but more locally, and the relative importance of Romano-British antecedents within the articulation of socio-political and economic systems in the early medieval period. This lack of consensus arises because of serious problems with the evidence base. There are very few contemporary historical sources, and despite numerous attempts, it is not possible to write a historical narrative for the ending of Roman Britain. There are also major difficulties with the archaeological record, the foremost of which lies in identifying diagnostic material culture of the early 5th century, and therefore attributing sites to this crucial period. The problem is compounded by the limitations of scientific dating techniques. Moreover, a tradition of scholarship which divides between distinct Romano-British and early medieval periods of study is also problematic and inhibits holistic analysis of the transition period as a whole. A considerable amount of literature has been published on the ending of Roman Britain, and the current situation is best characterized by David Mattingly's astute observation that the subject is one of few facts and many theories. In broad and somewhat oversimplified terms, the wide-ranging debate is characterized by those who argue in favor of widespread continuity between the late and post-Roman periods, and those who see more evidence of discontinuity associated with abrupt short-term change. It is fair to say, however, that the limitations of the evidence have led to something of an impasse. This project aims to move the debate forward by offering a different perspective and a new data set. Our aim is to undertake a programme of pollen analysis that offers a level of spatial and temporal resolution which permits detailed examination of patterns of land use across the Romano-British and post-Roman periods. This research focuses on a core area of lowland settlement, the coastal strip of South East Wales, rather than the sparsely occupied upland areas of blanket bog that are usually the focus of pollen studies. And particular emphasis is being placed on the examination of key indices of agricultural change, such as the proportions of arable, pastoral, and woodland indicator species in the pollen record. This approach is not constrained by the limitations of the historical sources and the on-site archaeology, but should provide direct evidence about the use and exploitation of the agricultural landscape, and therefore the continuity and/or discontinuity of socio-economic structures across the transition period. The idea that a landscape approach might help to solve the problem of the 5th century is not new. Important pollen-focused studies have been undertaken in the past, and special mention should be made of those led by Petra Dark and Stephen Rippon. But these studies are constrained by a lack of high-resolution data from core areas of lowland settlement. Thus, this project has required the development of new approaches to the collection and analysis of pollen data. We have focused our research on only a single comparatively small study area in South East Wales. Our analysis is not yet complete. We will not claim that our data could, or indeed should, be used to support an overarching interpretive framework for the ending of Roman Britain. Rather, we hope to reinvigorate and nuance the debate by adding a new perspective from an informative study area. Moreover, we hope to present a methodological framework that could be applied to research questions focused on other periods. Now, before I hand over to Tudor, who will talk about the methodology in more detail and present some preliminary results and interpretations, I will very briefly explain why South East Wales was chosen as a study region for this project. A series of factors were significant in this decision. Firstly, South East Wales lies on the edge of what is often described as the Highland zone of Roman Britain. But it has much more in common with the lowlands of the south and the east in terms of its economy and settlement archaeology. There is a major town at Carwent and roadside settlements such as Bullmore and Cowbridge, and a good number of villas, including those at Langstone, Five Lanes and Witton. And of course, also the legionary fortress at Caerleon. However, unlike lowland Britain, and indeed much of late antique Europe, South East Wales did not experience Anglo-Saxon or any other form of barbarian settlement or acculturation in the 5th and 6th centuries, thus making it an interesting case study in European terms. Secondly, the region contains a number of important and comparatively well understood early medieval economic and political centres, some of which may display some form of continuity from the 4th century. These sites include Carwent and the early medieval hill fort at Dinas Powys. South East Wales also has comparatively good historical evidence in the form of the Llandaff Charters, a series of rare but informative land grants dating as early as the 7th century, but which may potentially record territorial units that are Romano-British in origin. Finally, the region has previously been subject to major landscape studies, including Stephen Rippon's important work on the Gwent levels, which provide a good basis for further research. Okay, having now introduced the project and set the scene and explained what we're trying to do, I will hand over to Tudor, who will introduce the methodology and results in more detail. You're currently on mute.
Right. Our sampling site investigation process involved desk-based research that examined cartographic sources, including current and historic OS maps, geological maps, aerial photographs, and LiDAR data. This was followed by fieldwork to ground truth potential sites and core those deemed suitable deposits for analysis. Our sampling site investigation process involved, sites with softer sediments were cored using a Russian corer, and those with firmer sediments cored using a percussion corer. Out of a total of 111 potential sampling sites, 18 were cored and subject to further analysis. The exact chronological framework for the cores was established through a mixture of radiocarbon and paleomagnetic dating analysis. And for those of you who are unfamiliar with paleomagnetic dating analysis, it measures the orientation of magnetic particles within sediment to compare with recorded variations of inclination, declination, and intensity of the Earth's magnetic field. This analysis was undertaken at the National Oceanographic Centre in collaboration with Dr. Chuan Zhuan at the University of Southampton. Initially, while awaiting the results of scientific dating analysis, the cores were subject to portable XRF analysis, aiming to identify variation of atmospheric lead concentrations. High lead concentrations of Roman date have been noted in peat bogs and lake sediments across Europe, and even within the Greenland ice cores because of the substantial mining activity during that period. It was therefore hoped that we'd be able to identify sediments of Romano-British dates within our cores from the higher lead concentrations expected at that time, so the pollen analysis could start in anticipation of receiving results of scientific dating analysis. Unfortunately, however, we experienced firsthand some of the dangers of wiggle matching, as our early radiocarbon dates indicated that some of the high lead concentrations noted in our cores were prehistoric rather than Roman. The radiocarbon dates were therefore vital to provide a robust chronological framework for our research. In total, we used 46 radiocarbon dates to establish the broad chronology of our cores and determine the most relevant sites for further examination. This was followed by an additional rounds of radiocarbon dates, which included 21 dates to refine the chronology of our cores and select ones for detailed research. On receiving the results of this scientific dating analysis, we were able to accurately establish which cores would provide relevant environmental sequences for our research. This further reduced the sites with potentially relevant data to 4, 2 within each sub-region. The number of relevant sites in comparison with the number of coring sites is admittedly relatively low, but it does demonstrate the difficult nature of undertaking paleoenvironmental research in lowland contexts, which are often subject to high degrees of disturbance, and specifically in comparison to upland sampling sites. This is the very reason why there is such an upland bias in pollen studies, and why examining comparative lowland context, as we've done here, is vital to provide more nuanced understanding of environmental change. Analysis is ongoing on some of these sites and will continue after the end of the current lockdown, with a specific focus on the Vale of Glamorgan sampling sites. Today's presentation therefore focuses on the Carwent dataset, which has been completed to a higher degree and has the benefit of having additional sampling sites previously examined by Dr. Alex Brown at Castroggy to the north of our sampling sites. The sampling sites in the Caerwent region are located almost an equal distance between the Roman legionary fortress of Caerleon, roughly 6 kilometers to the west, and Caerwent's Roman town to the east. There are no definite early medieval settlements that's been identified archaeologically within this area, but our sampling sites at both Pantereos and Hollywood lie within the boundaries of known early medieval monastic estates. Pantereos is located on the northern edge of the Gwent Levels, the large area of wetland reclaimed by the Romans. Given its location, the pollen assemblage of this core should reflect a catchment which includes the Gwent Levels to the south and a much drier lowland context immediately to the north. This is one of the sites we initially focused a lot of our attention and resources following our initial radiocarbon dates, which indicated rapidly accumulating peat deposits covering the Romano-British and early post-Roman period. However, after additional radiocarbon analysis, the age depth plots changed from the one shown on the screen currently to this. In this revised depth plot, you'll see that there are dramatic radiocarbon date reversals indicating disturbance of some kind within the profile. Significantly, however, the radiocarbon dates only start to deviate above a layer of peat that was mixed in appearance. Below this, the radiocarbon dates are sequential. They have a relatively constant accumulation rates and, very importantly for us, still cover the period of interest of our research. It is unfortunate, however, that our initial pollen analysis has focused entirely on the wrong sequence within this core. Additional funds have been obtained, however, to analyse the lowest peat deposits within this core, but has been delayed by the COVID-19 outbreak, as indicated by Andy earlier, and cannot be presented today. Our second sampling site in this area, Hollywood, is located within the core settlement zone where several Iron Age settlements, villas, and additional evidence for Romano-British settlement has been identified. It is a very small sampling site consisting of peat deposits accumulating within an oxbow lake. Its pollen catchment should therefore provide localized information relating to land use and farming practices within this intensively settled landscape. Thankfully, the radiocarbon dates for this core suggest no indication of disturbance. The core has a nice sequence of sequential dates with an almost consistent accumulation rate for our period of interest. Castrogi is a sampling site previously analysed by Alex Brown, situated in the upland zone next to modern-day Wentwood, a name which possibly relates to its origins as ancient woodland. This site also has an excellent set of reliable radiocarbon dates. It is one of the very few pollen studies who have been taken in Wales with such high sampling frequencies for both pollen and radiocarbon dating within our period of interest. And we're very grateful to Alex for sharing this arrangement of data with us, and very fortunate to have it within the boundaries of our study area. All three sites are relatively small in size, which should, for the most part, mean that they have a localized pollen catchment. Our sites in this area therefore provide environmental information crossing from the edge of the Gwent Levels to the upland zone. As previously mentioned, we unfortunately can't present the data from Pantereos to you today, but when our analysis is complete, it should provide a nice cross-section of the landscape to analyse the changes in land use over both time and space. This is something our methodology specifically aimed to achieve, given that a number of studies have shown that individual cores in isolation don't necessarily provide a complete understanding of landscape within a given region. As Andy indicated earlier, our analysis is ongoing, so we must stress that the results are interim in nature and our conclusions may therefore change by the time we come to publication. This diagram shows a summary of our pollen analysis at Hollywood in comparison to the data from Castrogi by Brown. The chronology is based on the best FIS dates produced from our depth models from radiocarbon dating analysis. The summary of pollen taxa shows percentages of trees, shrubs, in black and dark grey respectively, in comparison with more open heath and herb species. Cereal type pollen is shown in orange as a species most indicative of arable land use, while Pantego lanceolata in green is a species highly indicative of pastoral land use. I should also point out that the fluctuations in cereal type pollen observed here matches the variation in other arable indicators and does not coincide with increased wetland species. This is significant as it is therefore indicative that it's a genuine reflection of arable activity as opposed to variation in wild grass types that fall into the same category as cereal type pollen. For example, Glyceria, which is a wetland species with similar characteristics to barley pollen grains. Our data from Hollywood covers a slightly longer time period than Castrogi, but focus specifically on the Romano-British and early medieval sequence. Castrogi has been examined in detail by Alex Brown with an excellent dating evidence covering the period from around the mid-1st century to around the start of the 7th century AD. It's worth noting that these two sites represent two of the most detailed palynological examinations of the Romano-British period and the transition into the early medieval period in Wales and indeed further afield. In general terms, you're lucky to see sampling frequencies with as much as 2 pollen samples covering the entirety of the Romano-British period, or more than around 3 for the early medieval period. In such instances, it's difficult to examine the very broad changes between each period and almost impossible to determine the timing, pace, and cultural significance of any environmental changes observed. The most striking difference we can see from the offset from Castrogi and Hollywood is that there are clear spatial differences between the two sampling sites, with an increased proportion of woodland near Castrogi and evidence for higher arable activity in the lowlands surrounding Hollywood. And for the most part, this is also an increased proportion of pastoral indicators at Castrogi, suggesting spatial differences in farming practices across this landscape. And while this is perhaps no surprise in its own right, it highlights the need to examine multiple coring sites to investigate changes in the farming economy through pollen analysis, as it would be difficult to see the trends in the arable economy from the data from Castrogi, which in turn shows very different results to Hollywood, despite being located only 3 kilometers north. Woodland levels are relatively low at both coring sites during the early Romano-British period. There's possible evidence for clearances within the data from both sites. This time, an increase in pastoral indicators is also observed at both cores. Whilst the evidence for pastoral activity is greater at Castrogi, the coinciding decrease in arable activity observed at Hollywood suggests a move towards mixed farming in the lowland zone from one previously focused predominantly on arable activity. Around the early to mid 3rd century, a decrease in pastoral indicators is seen at both sampling sites, coinciding with woodland regeneration. Based on the higher proportion of woodland increase at Castrogi in comparison to Hollywood, this woodland regeneration appears to be local to the upland of the study area at Castrogi. The woodland increases observed in the lowland core is believed therefore to represent changes local to Castrogi reaching Hollywood in the upland in the regional component of pollen rain. From around the mid 4th century, an increase in cereal type pollen is observed at Hollywood, while pastoral indicators remain relatively stable at both sites. The pastoral indicators at Castrogi remain stable until they decline at around the mid to late 6th century. At around the same time at Hollywood, an increase in pastoral and decreased arable indicators are observed, possibly indicating a shift again in pastoral activity from the upland to lowland zone. There is also a slight woodland increase at Castrogi that may indicate the abandonment of pastoral land in association with this. Brown had previously attributed changes in pastoral and woodland indicators at Castrogi during the Roman period to the occupation of the legionary fortress at Caerleon. The needs of the military driving up demand for pastoral produce while it was in occupation until the mid-3rd century, and its subsequent abandonment leading to woodland regeneration and pastoral decline. And the same argument can be used for the trend seen at Hollywood, from its increased pastoral indicators, while the reduced arable activity may reflect a greater need for a local source of pastoral products in comparison with grain. Given that it is less perishable than pastoral produce, grain could be imported more easily by boats, almost directly into the Fortress of Caerleon, given its location conveniently located near the banks of the mouth of the River Usk. During the transition from the Romano-British into the early medieval period, the pollen record for these two cores suggests continuity in the intensity of farming activities. The onset of high arable levels at Hollywood from the mid-4th century possibly relates to late military presence at Caerwent, as indicated by the high number of coins found from that period in the town. The need for arable produce may have been driven by the fact that the inland location of Caerwent meant that, in contrast to Caerleon, it could not be supplied by boat, and therefore needed local supply of crops to sustain its garrison and population of the town. However, irrespective of the possible military activity at Caerwent during the 4th century, the continuity in intensity of both pastoral and arable indicators observed in the pollen record also suggest a degree of continuity in the local farming economy and the tenural relationships that maintained that intensity. In this instance, the evidence suggests that these tenural relationships with possible links to Roman administrative systems continued over a period of at least a century and a half into the early medieval period. This data, however, contrasts to what's been observed elsewhere in Wales at this time. My own research indicates widespread woodland and heath regeneration along reduced farming activity on the onset of the early medieval period. Elsewhere in England, the preliminary results of Emily Forster on the feed sacks project also supports this, indicating widespread, though not universal, decline in woodland, and the general picture of loss of farmland, reduced arable intensity, and a shift to pasture in the immediate post-Roman period. Though there are also isolated cases where slight increase in or continuity in arable activity is noted, as in the data for Wales also. We therefore need to consider why the data from Southeast Wales differs from the regional trends seen in Wales and much of England. There are methodological considerations that may explain some of these differences. For example, error margins in radiocarbon dates and the frequency of dating and pollen analysis. Other sites across Wales are not as well dated as those for the current study, nor do they have as many pollen samples analysed from this period. More detailed analysis elsewhere may well show similar trends to those observed here. For example, had we only analysed samples from the 2nd century in comparison to the 5th century, we may have concluded there was a reduction in pastoral activity rather than continuity. Likewise, had we not examined a core from a lowland context, we may not have been able to observe the trends seen in the arable economy. Of course, we should also consider the differences in cultural context between our study area and the majority of Wales, which did not adopt Roman material culture, architecture, or any other cultural practices as thoroughly. It isn't therefore surprising that Southeast Wales exhibits a greater degree of cultural continuity from the Roman times. It does not, however, explain the evidence for discontinuity in farming practices in more Romanized areas of England, as noted by the Feed Sacks project. This is something that requires further consideration once we have finished our analysis. In conclusion, our results reinforce the fact that it is almost impossible to understand the full nature of landscape changes across a given region from the results of pollen analysis of a single core in isolation. From a methodological perspective, we have demonstrated that it is, in an ideal situation, multiple coring sites should be examined from different landscape zones. It is appreciated that this is cost prohibitive in many cases and also difficult to achieve in its own right. But due consideration of the landscape context and limitations of sampling sites is key. We acknowledge, of course, that we ourselves are yet to achieve a full understanding of this landscape. To this end, we look forward to incorporating the results of our pollen analysis from Pantereos, which will enable an examination of changes associated with the exploitation of reclaimed land on the Gwent levels in comparison with other landscape contexts. Examination of the cores collected from the Vale of Glamorgan study area will also enable an assessment of the geographical scale of environmental changes seen in the vicinity of Caerleon and Caerwent. Of course, even then, there is likely to be localized variation in land use in this region that will not be reflected in the pollen record of the site analysed. This project also reinforces the need for high frequency of sampling for both pollen and radiocarbon dating within cores to understand environmental changes in relation to cultural variation. The detailed analysis undertaken by the current study and by Brown's work shows that patterns of land use during the Romano-British period are by no means static. They are highly complex in their own right, changing over time according to the localized needs of the Roman Empire within a given area. The high frequency of sampling, as undertaken by this study, is therefore vital to understand changes in land use within the Romano-British period, which in turn guides our understanding of the varying degrees of continuity into the post-Roman period. In terms of cultural significance, the evidence for continuity in South East Wales stands in contrast to what's seen elsewhere across Wales and further afield. Although there are possible methodological considerations as to why this is the case in some instances, we should acknowledge that there is a difference in multiple cases. Across much of Wales, this is possibly because of differences in the adoption of Roman lifestyles, and that the more Romanized southeast would be more likely to provide evidence of continuity. Bearing in mind also that these are the areas that later adopted open field systems and are more suitable to arable land use in general. However, this does not explain the decline in the farming economy observed elsewhere in England, for example. As just discussed, there are big changes in the pollen record, even within the Roman period. To the point we should really consider untethering ourselves from the linchpin date of 410 to understand the differences between two periods. We would also suggest that given the regional differences in the pollen record, we should move away from overarching models that have such polarized standpoints for cultural changes associated with the Romano-British early medieval transition. Instead, we suggest that a more regional and more local perspective should be considered to examine why we see the divergences across the former Roman world. Andy, do you want to come in on anything else at this point? You're on mute.
There we go. Okay. Right. Yeah, I'll just sort of echo some points and some highlights and some others. I mean, I think the thing which really marked this project out was the sheer number of sites we or you had to visit. Was it 180? The
111 some potential sites.
Yeah. So over 100 potential sampling sites were visited, trial cored, and then struck off or included, and to whittle down to a number of 4. So it is hard work to find these sites, but they do provide fantastic evidence when you can find them. And the sort of second point really is we need not expect the landscape, even on a local scale, to be homogeneous in the sort of intensities of agriculture that we see. We are doing this analysis on the scale where we would expect to see the influence of things like infield and outfield, and different levels of exploitation at a comparatively local scale. And to be able to draw any sort of broader conclusion about what that might be telling us in terms of social political structures and economic structures, we need to have these sort of multiple sites to be able to get a much broader picture. Tillis moves on to the acknowledgement slide here, and the main part of the project was funded by HRC, with radiocarbon dating coming from the NERC board as well. But since this is a Society of Antiquaries lecture, we should note that the origins of this project were in 2013, when we undertook a very small pilot study just to see if we could identify some sampling sites, and that was funded by a small grant from the Society of Antiquaries of £2,500. And it was from those that initial small grant that this much bigger project has come. So we're very grateful for that initial grant. And I'm sure Tudor will want to thank the field assistants and whatnot. So I hand back over to Tudor.
Well, yeah, just to say thank you to everyone really who's involved in the fieldwork, and as well to those institutions, as well as the antiquaries that funded radiocarbon dates for the project as well, including and various other elements of the project, including the Cambrian Archaeological Association, the Society for Medieval Archaeology, and the Medieval Settlement Research Group. And of course, a big thanks also goes to Alex Brown, who shared his data with us, which has been great to have that original core data to have a look at and compare with our data. So yeah, thank you to everyone on that list, really.
Great. Well, thank you very much indeed, Andy and Tudor. I take it is time for me to come in there. So just sort of take it that there is a round of applause, in the normal way going around here. I do hope that people will start typing in now comments and questions to come in through the chat function, please. In my experience, this does take a minute or two for those to appear. Can I just ask, is everybody else got a yellow box there about some shared? Oh no, it's disappeared now. So that may have moved on there now. While people are thinking about their questions, maybe I can sort of use the chair's privilege to put in one or two that I would like to hear your views on. The first one actually is in relation to the radiocarbon evidence that you've got. Have you had the opportunity yet to reassess it in light of the new calibration curve that was issued last summer in Cal 20, or alternatively, has IntCal 20 made any significant difference or just moved things a bit?
In answer to that, yes, we have used the new calibration curves. It was something I updated for this talk, in fact, given we haven't been able to do a huge amount of work on the project since, since the first lockdown, and since that time the new calibration curves have arrived. In terms of the difference it's made, it has shifted things slightly in some instances, but not to a significant effect. I think certainly the pace at which we see changes hasn't changed at all. It's just slight variation in the best fit states and the calibration, the potential range of the error. But in general terms, it's reduced some of the errors in the early medieval period. New calibration curves is actually much better for the early medieval period. So that's strengthens our dating models and makes the data even more robust, which is ideal for us.
Yeah, that's absolutely true. And I've also been aware myself, though sort of dealing with very different data, is that whereas previously one had some samples which, even if you knew they were, shall we say, on the early medieval rather than the late Roman side of a particular divide, the radiocarbon date nevertheless spread inconveniently right the way through from the late 4th century through in some cases to the early 6th, whereas now those have definitely moved later, and there is quite a clear distinction between the two periods. The supplementary question that I've got for that is a much more interpretive one, is, and it's something that I could imagine happening with the radiocarbon date, if we move away from an AD 410 or AD 408, 411 horizon as some real watershed in things, is it possible that we'll actually move to an AD 536 and the big dust veil event then as being a major thing? Are you picking up any evidence of that tremendous climatic event, do you think?
Currently, I mean, we haven't looked at the climate data in as much detail as we will do. But what I will say now is that we're seeing no significant change in our cultural indicators or disturbance indicators in terms of the farming economy. The changes we're seeing in arable happens slightly before then, and there's continuity in terms of the high intensity of arable, certainly, that we're seeing in our lowland core. Quite significantly as well, those changes in arable we're seeing happens in contrast to the wetland indicators that I've seen. So we're not seeing very significant changes in wetland at the same time. In fact, in some cases, it's declining in association with those increased arable levels. So currently, no, but at the same time, I will add the caveat that we haven't looked at that aspect in detail yet.
Great. Well, questions are now starting to come in on the chat function, so I will sort of hand over to our guests and members here. So first of all, a question from Nancy Edwards up in Bangor, I suppose. Hello, Nancy. When you analyse a pollen sequence, what is the average catchment area for a particular sample? Is it, for example, a number of fields, or will it be a much wider area that you're picking up evidence from?
Pollen catchment is one of those things that are very, very difficult to define. Generally speaking, the smaller the size of your sampling site, the smaller the size of the pollen catchments in terms of, how, or the percent, there's a higher proportion of local pollen within your pollen catchment with a smaller pollen sampling site. There's always a degree of regional pollen rain within your core, no matter what's the size of your pollen sampling sites. And likewise, there's with bigger sampling sites, there's a certain degree of local vegetation within that site as well. But it's just the proportion of local to non-local varies, generally associated with how small a sampling site is. Also, can also vary according to how open your sampling site is. So if the site is surrounded by woodland, for example, there's a greater degree of local pollen coming to your sampling sites, because the regional pollen just can't get to the sampling sites as easily. So there are a number of factors that can affect the scale of where pollen is coming to your sampling site from. Another thing that's very important to consider is the fact that studies of cereal pollen distribution shows that it doesn't really travel very far. So when you're looking at cereal pollen within a pollen diagram, that is generally coming from a very, very short distance. Some of the studies have shown that some cereal pollen barely travels 10 meters or so. So the fact that we are getting very, very high cereal pollen in our cores shows that people are growing crops in the very, very local context to our sampling sites at Hollywood, certainly. And the low numbers that you're seeing at Castrogi, there could be a small amount of cultivation happening nearby, but the low levels we're seeing there may indicate that it's more likely to come from elsewhere.
All right. Thanks. Were you coming in there, Andy?
Yes, just to sort of note really that one of the things we're doing with this project is we're very interested in the landscape context of our sampling sites within the historic agricultural landscape. So we are interested in, are they appearing in areas of medieval open field? And that is going to influence how we're going to approach the interpretation of them. So one of the things we're doing is looking at that very local context to help inform our interpretation. And two of these sites do come from documented early medieval estates. So Hollywood is a little wet patch in the corner of a documented estate. And we should be able to, as we get further data, we should be able to get quite a detailed picture of really what's happening there.
Okay, great, thank you. Question has come in, well, an observation and a question has come in from Chris Hunt, I think in Liverpool. Hello, Chris. Thank you very much for the presentation. Very similar dating wiggles were found for roughly the same time by Lisa Coyle McClung on a PhD on this particular period in Northern Ireland. This seems to be part of a fairly general phenomenon, but he says, what this is, I do not know. Do you have any thoughts?
In data wiggles in terms of the trends in the farming economy, where, I mean, it's something that we're not too sure about because, because of the context, the landscape context and the cultural context that we've seen at Caerwent is very different to what we have elsewhere in Wales, where we do have similar trends. It's something that needs detailed exploration in terms of why we're seeing those trends in those specific places. And I think that we're coming back to our overall message of, we need to have a localized perspective of why things are so different here to elsewhere, and why in those instances we do see evidence of continuity or increased farming inputs alongside this transition. We need to look in detail on why those specific cases differ from the norm and look at those specific local contexts. Would you agree with that one, Andy?
Yes, yeah, and this is another thing we will go and read and have a look at that data and see how it matches. Yeah.
Mm.
Great. Question from Peter Seaman. Does the pollen analysis of woodland indicated any changes in the tree species populations, which might in turn be indicative of woodland use? And I suppose that would also mean woodland management as well.
There are certainly variations in the woodland that we can see within the pollen data. One of the things you see sometimes is changes in alder pollen, for example, or willow that can be indicative of wetland woodland, as opposed to a woodland on drier land, etc. Again, we've not looked at that in detail, so I will add the caveat that this data hasn't been analysed, all of our analysis done, but certainly we are seeing those variations in certain woodland species that may give us an indication of what's happening in the climate, and also in terms of woodland management practices, and we'll definitely be looking at those in detail further along in the project.
I presume the catchment of woodland pollen kind of makes it a bit more difficult there as well, being it travelling so far.
It does, yes, but when you have, as we do have in some instances in our cores, where it's so high to the extent that it might be coming from a local context, you can then look at what might be happening locally as opposed to much further afield. One of our pollen species, for example, that we have in our cores, it comes from, I can't remember the name of the species off the top of my head, but it's one that doesn't grow in the United Kingdom, it's come from continental Europe. So wood pollen, for example, travels significant distances and can cause interest. You have to interpret it very carefully. But having said that, there are certain things you can look at within that to have more robust conclusions, and certainly looking at when you compare the levels of woodland from each of our sampling sites, we should be able to see, well, which of our sampling sites is closer to that source of woodland, and what that tells us about farming practices and land use specific to those sites.
You did seem to have, if I remember correctly, really a very marked surge in woodland indicators at Castroggy. I think in the 6th and 7th century, but it's not that easy to read across. Did that have specific species that seemed to be standing up there? Because that was an upland side.
That upland, again, I can't remember from the top of my head, so I'm not going to pull a diagram in front of me. I don't check. But
interesting what the public would like to know about this thing. So great. Okay, thanks very, very much for that, Dida. Can I ask, are there any more questions and comments to come in from anybody? Not at the moment. Well, okay. Well, thank you very, very much indeed, Tudur and Andy. We, as the Welsh Fellows, owe you both a good lunch at some stage when it's possible to do that again, but it would be even better if you can come and join us as a group on one of our sort of events, and we can sort of work that all into it at the same time. Thank you everybody who has been listening to this, and for the comments and views and questions that have come in. I'm happy to give notice too that the next online event lecture that is being hosted by the Society is one of the regular Thursday ordinary meetings. You can see the details there on your screen, that Peter Halken, FSA, and Paula Ware will be speaking of chariots in the landscape of East Yorkshire, with recent discoveries at Pocklington and region. And as I say, exactly a month after that, we'll be having our next Welsh hosted event on the 4th of March. So in fact, I've spotted one or two more in the programme for the spring that have got real Welsh interest, in the midst, of course, of many that are very interesting otherwise. So as a thank you once again, consider yourselves roundly applauded, please, speakers, for this, and very best wishes to everybody who I hope to be seeing in person before very long. Keep safe. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank you.